Some endings don't announce themselves. There's no argument, no slammed door. Just a cold Tuesday morning. A sealed envelope slid across a mahogany desk, and 2 minutes that unravel 5 years in silence. Audrey Clarke walks out without a single tear. Jason Mercer watches her go without a second thought. But what neither of them knows yet is that the real story isn't ending. It's just beginning to cost him everything. Before we go further, if this story already has you hooked, hit subscribe, leave a like and drop a comment telling us where you're listening from. Now let's find out what happens next. The Mercer Group occupied the 42nd floor of a glass tower on 6th Avenue, and on Tuesday mornings, the building hummed with a particular kind of ambition: espresso machines running at full capacity, laptops glowing behind floor-to-ceiling windows, the city 40 floors below moving like something alive and indifferent. Audrey Clarke stepped off the elevator at 8:47 a.m. Her camel wool coat still cold from the November air outside, her tote bag heavy with a laptop, and the kind of organized chaos that only she could decode. She already knew, she had known since Sunday. Actually, when Jason Mercer had cancelled their Monday briefing with a 2-word, "Text not necessary," in 5 years as his executive assistant, she had learned to read the architecture of his silences the way other people read weather. A cancelled briefing meant a decision had already been made. A 2-word text meant he didn't want to explain it. She stopped at her desk only long enough to set down her bag and check that the reports she'd spent the weekend compiling were still neatly filed in the cloud. Then she straightened her blazer, deep burgundy, fitted, the kind of professional armor a woman wears when she already knows the battle is over, and walked toward his office. The door was open. It was always open when he wanted to project control. Jason Mercer stood behind his desk rather than sitting, which meant he was uncomfortable. He was 38, built with the kind of angular precision that expensive suits amplified rather than created, and his dark eyes tracked her the moment she crossed the threshold. He didn't greet her. He gestured toward the chair across from him with one hand, and with the other slid a white envelope across the polished surface of the desk. Audrey, just her name, nothing attached to it. She sat. She looked at the envelope but didn't touch it. "The board voted on a structural reorganization Friday evening," he said. His voice was composed. That particular flatness he used in rooms where emotion would cost him something. "Your position is being eliminated. The envelope contains your severance package, which is generous," she said quietly. "I'm sure it is." He paused. Something flickered behind his eyes, fast and unreadable, like a notification dismissed before it could load. "You'll have full benefits through the end of the quarter. IT will need your credentials by noon." Audrey sat with that for a moment. The office smelled like coffee and cedar, his preferred candle, which she had once ordered in bulk from a small shop in Vermont because she'd noticed he worked better when it was burning. She wondered briefly if whoever replaced her would ever know that detail. Probably not. "Is there anything else?" she asked. "The reference letter is included," he said. "It's strong. I know it will be." She stood, picked up the envelope without opening it, and smoothed the front of her coat. "You write good letters, Jason. You always have." She used his first name. She almost never did. He noticed. She saw it in the slight tension that moved across his jaw, the way his hand stilled against the desk. Audrey looked at him then, not with anger, not with the performance of dignity that pride sometimes demands. She looked at him the way someone looks at a city they're about to leave, taking in the skyline one final time, memorizing the light. It lasted 4 seconds, maybe 5. Long enough to be something more than a glance. Long enough that he would think about it later, alone in that same office, and not be able to name what it was. "Good luck with the restructure," she said. She turned, walked through the open door and didn't look back. Her heels were quiet against the polished concrete floor, a deliberate choice she'd made years ago, because in an office full of men who measured power in noise, silence was its own language. At the reception desk, she handed over her badge, smiled briefly at the security guard, who looked away as if he'd witnessed something private. Pressed the elevator button. The doors opened immediately, as if the building itself had been waiting. Inside, she did not cry. She pressed the lobby button, watched the floor numbers count down, and let herself feel just for 39 floors, the full Complicated weight of 5 years, handed back in a sealed envelope. The anger was there, small and precise, but underneath it, something quieter. The sensation of a door closing on a room she'd furnished, with care, for someone who had never once looked at the walls. The lobby doors opened onto 6th Avenue. The city was cold and indifferent, and absolutely full of possibility. She walked into it without hesitating. 42 floors above her, Jason Mercer returned to his desk, picked up his phone, and spent The Mercer Group's IT department occupied a windowless suite on the 38th floor, a deliberate architectural choice that Jason had always found practical, and his employees had always found punishing. By 11:30 that Tuesday morning, 3 technicians were gathered around a single monitor, their faces lit blue by the glow of something they clearly hadn't expected to find. Marcus Webb, the head of IT, knocked on Jason's office door at 12:04. He was holding a printed access log and wearing the expression of a man who had just opened the wrong cabinet and found something that couldn't be unseen. "We need the legal team," Marcus said. "Now." Jason looked up from his screen. "What kind of now?" "The kind where I've already called them and they're on their way up." The folder had been sitting on the company's encrypted server for 91 days, hidden beneath a filing structure so precise and methodical that the IT team had initially mistaken it for a system backup. It was labeled with a date stamp and a single set of initials, AC. When the lawyers cracked the encryption at 12:47, the conference room went very, very quiet. Inside were 412 files, scanned contracts with digital alterations, visible only under forensic comparison. Wire transfer records routed through a shell company registered in Delaware. Internal emails time-stamped and cross-referenced, mapping a pattern of financial diversion that stretched back almost 2 years. Each file was annotated, cleanly, without drama, with a single line of context explaining its significance. The name that appeared on every fraudulent document was Daniel Holt, Jason's business partner of 20 years, his college roommate, the man who had delivered a toast at Jason's mother's retirement party 11 months ago and made the entire room laugh. Jason stood at the head of the conference table and read. He didn't speak. The lawyers spoke around him in low, clipped sentences about exposure and liability and criminal referral, and he heard all of it from somewhere slightly outside himself, as if the room had developed a faint delay between sound and meaning. The annotations, he kept returning to the annotations. They were written in Audrey's voice, not her speaking voice, but her thinking voice, the one she used in briefing documents when she wanted him to understand. Something without being condescending about it, clear, precise, economical. This transfer occurs 4 days before the quarterly audit. Cross-reference Exhibit 7. He could hear her saying it. He could hear the careful patience of someone who had spent months in the dark, alone building something watertight so that when she finally handed it over, it would hold, except she hadn't handed it over. He had handed her an envelope instead. Mr. Mercer, one of the attorneys, a woman named Patricia Cho, whom Jason had always respected, precisely because she never softened difficult information, set a single page in front of him. Based on what's here, Miss Clarke had been conducting this investigation independently for at least 3 months. There's no indication she involved anyone else in the firm. No indication she planned to use it for personal leverage. A pause. Every file is organized to protect the company. Not herself. Jason looked at the page without picking it up. She was going to tell me, he said. It wasn't a question. Patricia's expression didn't change. That would be my reading, yes. The room held its breath. He picked up his phone. Audrey's contact was still on the screen from that morning, still undialed, still waiting with the passivity of things that have learned not to expect much. His thumb hovered. The attorneys were watching him, with the studied neutrality of people paid to observe without reacting. He put the phone down, picked it up again. The screen showed 1:13 p.m. Audrey had left the building exactly 4 hours and 26 minutes ago. By now she could be anywhere. Her apartment in Brooklyn, a coffee shop with her laptop, already updating her resume with the efficient, unsentimental speed of someone who had survived harder mornings than this one. Or she could be sitting somewhere very still, he thought, the way she sometimes went still in meetings when she was processing something. That mattered. That particular quality of attention she had that made you feel, when it was directed at you, like the most important variable in the room, he had fired the one person in the building who had been trying to save it. The thought didn't arrive with drama. It settled the way cold settles, as gradually, completely, until you realize you've been sitting in it for longer than you knew. "Get me her address," he said. Patricia raised one measured eyebrow. "We have a process, Mr. Mercer. The appropriate first step is a formal." "I know what the appropriate first step is." He was already standing, already reaching for his jacket from the back of the chair. "Get me her address anyway." Outside the conference room windows, Manhattan gleamed in the pale November light, 42 floors below. Indifferent as always, full of people making decisions they would spend years. The drive east had taken 4 hours and 11 minutes, which Audrey knew precisely because she had tracked it, not obsessively, but with the same quiet attention she gave to everything that mattered. She had left Brooklyn at 3 in the afternoon, the back seat of her Subaru loaded with 3 cardboard boxes, a duffel bag, and a Nikon camera she hadn't touched since the autumn of her 29th year. The camera had lived on the top shelf of her closet in a canvas case, beneath a sweater she never wore, patient as something that knew its time was coming. Montauk in November was a different country. The town that spent its summers drowning in weekenders and rosé-soaked sunsets had exhaled itself back into something honest. Weathered shingle houses, empty parking lots, surf shops with hand-lettered "closed for the season" signs, taped inside dark windows. The Atlantic came in hard and grey off the coast, and the air smelled of salt and kelp, and the particular cold that has no interest in being romantic about itself. Audrey had rolled down the car window 2 miles out and just breathed. The cottage she'd found online belonged to a woman named Evelyn, who was 73 and had the eyes of someone who had outlived several reasons to ask unnecessary questions. She handed Audrey a key on a driftwood keychain, pointed out the extra blankets in the hall closet, mentioned that the second burner on the stove ran hot, and left without ceremony. Audrey had stood in the small living room, hardwood floors, a stone fireplace, windows that faced directly west toward the water, and felt something shift in her chest. Not happiness exactly, something quieter. The sensation of a held breath finally released. She unpacked methodically, the way she did everything, clothes in the dresser, laptop on the kitchen table, camera on the windowsill where the light would hit it. First thing in the morning, the 3 cardboard boxes contained books, a French press, and 5 years of the small accumulations that distinguish a life lived attentively from one merely endured, a ceramic mug from a market in Porto, a print of a Vivian Maier photograph, a small brass compass that had belonged to her father. She set the compass on the mantel and didn't look at it again. The first evening, she walked the beach until the light failed completely, shoes off despite the cold, jeans rolled to the knee, the sand dark and packed firm at the waterline. The waves were loud enough to think inside, which was what she needed. Not silence, but volume, something to fill the space where 5 years of structured purpose had been. She didn't think about Jason. Or she tried not to, which amounted to almost the same thing. She thought instead about the investigation, the 91 nights of quiet, careful work, the folders she had organized with the precision of someone who understood that the truth to be believed must be immaculate. She had been 3 days from telling him. She had drafted the email 4 times, each version more measured than the last, each one finding a different way to say, "Someone you trust is dismantling. Everything you built and I can prove it." Then Sunday came and the 2-word text, and Tuesday morning in the office that smelled like his cedar candle. She had walked out. She had made herself walk out. On the second morning, she burned the first batch of blueberry muffins she'd attempted since culinary school, forgot them entirely while watching a cormorant work the shoreline outside the kitchen window. When the smoke alarm went off, she stood on a chair to silence it, looked down at the blackened remains in the tin and laughed. Genuinely, without reservation, the kind of laugh that surprises you with its own sincerity. She couldn't remember the last time she had burned something. In the Mercer group kitchen she had always been precise, measured, timed, correct. Out here she could afford to be imperfect. She took the camera out that afternoon. The light on the Montauk coast at 4:30 in November had a quality she'd forgotten, low and amber and slightly mournful, The kind that makes ordinary things look like they're being seen for the last time. She photographed the empty lifeguard stands, the seagrass bending in unison, a red kayak chained to a post outside a closed rental shop. She didn't edit as she went, she just shot, trusting her instincts the way she'd once trusted them. Before 5 years of anticipating someone else's needs had quietly recalibrated her sense of what mattered. The camera felt like a conversation she'd been meaning to resume. That evening, scrolling through the day's shots on her laptop, she found one she hadn't consciously composed. A long shadow stretched across wet sand, her own, the low sun making it longer than she actually was. She looked at it for a long time. In the window's reflection, she could see the compass on the mantel behind her. She hadn't looked at it, but she knew without turning around that it was still pointing the same direction it always had. Jason Mercer had not taken an unplanned Friday afternoon off in 11 years. His assistant, the temporary one, a composed young man named Trevor, who had lasted 4 days before learning not to initiate conversation before 10, had looked genuinely alarmed when Jason told him to clear the afternoon, not reschedule. Clear. The drive to Montauk took 4 hours in Friday traffic, which gave him too much time and not enough distraction. He had tried a podcast for 40 minutes, then music for 20, then silence, which turned out to be the worst option, because silence had a way of organizing his thoughts into an order he didn't particularly want to face. He drove with both hands on the wheel of his charcoal BMW, the Long Island Expressway unreeling in front of him, and spent most of the drive doing what he was worst at, sitting with something he couldn't fix with a decision. The letter was on the passenger seat. 4 drafts had preceded it, each one discarded not because the words were wrong, but because he kept catching himself sounding like a man managing a situation rather than one admitting to something. His mother had read the 3rd draft over the phone and been uncharacteristically quiet for a moment before saying, "Jason, this reads like a settlement offer." He had started over. The final version was handwritten, which had cost him more than he expected. He typed everything. He had typed condolence cards and birthday messages, and a note to his college mentor when the man retired. Handwriting required a different kind of commitment. Slower, irreversible, each word sitting permanently in its own ink. He'd used a fountain pen he hadn't touched in years, sitting at his kitchen island at midnight, and the act of it had felt uncomfortably close to confession. He found the cottage just after 4:30, a grey shingled structure set back from a gravel road, its west-facing windows catching the last of the afternoon light. A Subaru with Brooklyn plates was parked outside. Smoke drifted from the chimney, thin and pale, the kind that meant a fire recently started, rather than one long established. He pulled up behind the Subaru and sat in his car for a full 3 minutes, which he recognized as avoidance and did anyway. The letter felt heavier than paper had any right to be. He got out. The cold came immediately, salt air and the distant percussion of waves, the sky beginning its early November transition from blue to something that couldn't decide between grey and gold. He walked the short path to the front door and stopped. 90 seconds. He counted them without meaning to. Then he knocked. Footsteps, unhurried, unbothered. The door opened and there she was. And nothing about her matched the version of Audrey Clarke he'd been carrying in his head since Tuesday. In the office she had been composed, architectural almost, every detail considered, nothing accidental. Here she was barefoot on a cold hardwood floor, wearing dark jeans and an oversized cream sweater with flower on the left sleeve. Her hair pulled back in a way that suggested she hadn't thought about it once. She was holding a dish towel. She looked at him the way you look at weather you hadn't checked, not afraid of, it just recalibrating. Jason. Not a greeting exactly, more like a fact being confirmed. "I should have called," he said. "Yes." She didn't move from the doorway. "You should have." The wind came in off the coast and moved between them, carrying the smell of wood smoke and something baking. He noticed the flower on her sleeve. He noticed that she wasn't wearing the careful expression she wore in the office, that professional composure that had always made her excellent at her job and difficult to read, out here, without the glass and steel architecture of the Mercer group around her. She looked like someone who had recently remembered who she was before all of UA. That, it was somehow more unsettling than anger would have been. I read the files, he said. I know, Audrey, I know, she said again, quieter. Something moved behind her eyes. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the acknowledgement of a conversation that had been waiting too long to be avoided. She looked at the letter in his hand, then back at him, then at some point just past his shoulder, where the light was going amber over the water. She stepped back from the door. Not widely, just enough. Wipe your shoes, she said. And don't touch the oven. I finally got the temperature right. He stepped inside. The cottage was warm and low-ceilinged and smelled like cedar and blueberries, and something that felt improbably like the opposite of the 42nd floor. He set the letter on the small table beside the door, and she didn't look at it, and he didn't mention it, but it sat there between them like a question neither of them was ready to answer at full volume. The door closed behind him, and outside, the November light finished its slow collapse into dark. The conditions were delivered over the kitchen counter, Audrey on one side and Jason on the other. The way negotiations happen, when both parties understand that the alternative is worse than the terms. Guest room is at the end of the hall, she said, not looking up from the dough she was folding. There are clean towels in the cabinet above the sink. The Wi-Fi password is on a card next to the router. Don't change any settings. The connection out here is already fragile. She paused, pressing the heel of her hand into the dough with practiced precision. Nothing about the company before 9 in the morning. And don't mistake this for something it isn't. Jason stood on the other side of the counter with his jacket still on, watching her work. What is it then? She looked up briefly. An inconvenient conversation that needed a civilized location. He accepted. That with a single nod and didn't push, which surprised her slightly. The Jason Mercer she knew in the office pushed on. Everything. Tested every boundary, with the quiet persistence of someone who believed all. Resistance was negotiable. This version set his jacket over the back of a chair and asked where she kept the coffee without touching anything he hadn't been invited to touch. By the second morning, something had shifted in the texture of the days. They fell into a rhythm neither had designed. Coffee on the narrow back porch, while the Atlantic fog rolled in from the east, thick and muffling, turning the world beyond the yard into a soft grey suggestion. Audrey wrapped both hands around her mug and watched the fog move. Jason stood beside her with his own coffee, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his sleeve, and said nothing, which turned out to be exactly the right thing. He had attempted to start the fireplace the previous evening. The attempt had involved 3 fire-starting cubes, a YouTube tutorial he'd watched on his phone while crouching in front of the hearth, and a smoke situation that had required opening 2 windows despite the cold. Audrey had appeared in the doorway, assessed the scene in approximately 4 seconds, adjusted the flue he'd forgotten to open, and had the fire going in under a minute. You went to Harvard, she said. Business, he replied from the floor, still holding the tutorial on his phone. Not chimneys, she had laughed. A real one unguarded. The kind she produced rarely and couldn't manufacture. He'd looked up at the sound of it, like a man hearing something he hadn't, realized he'd been waiting for. The touches came without announcement, the way small true things do. On the third morning, reaching across him for the coffee grinder, her hand brushed his forearm, and neither of them moved for half a second longer than accidental contact requires. She felt it, the specific awareness that moves through the body when proximity becomes something more than physical. She stepped back, continued grinding the coffee, said nothing. He said nothing either, but his eyes tracked her across the kitchen with an attention that had nothing to do with business, and she was aware of it the way you're aware of weather changing before the sky shows it. Later, walking the beach with their respective silences, she said something about the light on the water, the way November flattened it, made it look pewter, industrial, like something built rather than natural. He listened with the focused stillness he almost never used in the office, where his attention was always distributed across 17 things simultaneously. Out here she had all of it. The weight of it was unfamiliar and not entirely comfortable. You're finishing my sentences, he said suddenly. She glanced at him. What? 3 times this morning. I started saying something and you finished it before I got there. He wasn't accusatory. More like someone reading a document and finding a line they didn't expect. You've been doing it for years, haven't you? Audrey looked back at the water. It was part of the job. It wasn't in the job description. Neither were the Seder candles, she said. But you worked better when they were burning. So I ordered them. He stopped walking. She took 2 more steps before stopping as well and turning back to face him. The wind off the Atlantic moved through her hair, and he stood with his hands in the pockets of his coat, looking at her with an expression she had never once seen on him in 5 years. Something open, unguarded, slightly undone, like a man confronting the precise dimensions of his own blindness. Audrey, don't, she said quietly, not harshly. The way you say don't to something fragile, to protect it rather than stop it. Not yet. He closed his mouth, nodded once. They walked back to the cottage, in a silence that had changed its quality, entirely. No longer the silence of 2 people avoiding something, but of 2 people circling the same thing from opposite directions, drawing closer with each pass, without yet naming the distance between them. Inside, the fire was still going. She had built it well enough to last. The Montauk Lighthouse sat at the eastern tip of Long Island like something that had decided a very long time ago to stop moving and simply witness. It rose white and brick-banded above the bluffs, surrounded by wind-bent scrub and the particular kind of silence that exists only at the edge of things, where land concedes to ocean and the horizon, becomes a fact rather than a suggestion. Audrey had driven them out in the Subaru at 4 in the afternoon, camera bag on the back seat, saying only that the light would be right and that he should bring an extra. Leia. Jason had brought the jacket and left the questions in the car. She worked the rocks below the bluff with the focused economy of someone who had never needed an audience. She moved without hesitation, crouching low to frame the lighthouse against her. Sky that was beginning its slow conversion from blue to amber, shifting left without looking to avoid a patch of wet rock. Adjusting the lens with the automatic confidence of a fluency long dormant, but not forgotten. He stood several feet back and watched her work, his hands in his coat pockets, the Atlantic wind pressing cold and persistent against the left side of his face. He had watched her work for 5 years. He realized, standing on those rocks, that he had never actually seen it. In the office, her competence had been something he relied on, the way you rely on. Infrastructure, present, functional, not requiring examination. Out here, without the context of desks and schedules and the architecture of professional distance, it looked different. It looked like her, specific and unhurried and entirely self-sufficient, needing nothing from him to be complete. The light shifted. The sky went deep amber, and the ocean beneath it became something hammered and luminous, and Audrey lowered the camera and just looked at it for a moment. The way she sometimes stopped mid-sentence, when something required the full attention of her senses rather than just the working portion. He moved to stand beside her. The rocks were uneven and the wind was sharp and the view was objectively extraordinary. That quality of Atlantic light at dusk in November that makes the world look simultaneously ancient and immediate. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. She knew what he meant. She always knew what he meant, which was, he understood now, part of the problem. About the fraud specifically, he continued, or about any of it. Any of what you knew. Audrey kept her eyes on the water for a moment. Then she raised the camera again and shot twice before answering. Not avoidance. He'd learned, but the way she bought herself the space to say something true rather than something easy. She lowered the camera and turned to look at him directly. The amber light caught the side of her face and held it. "Because you would have made it about yourself," she said. The words were quiet and without cruelty, which made them land harder than anger would have. He felt them arrive, felt the specific, uncomfortable accuracy of them settle into his chest like something physical. "The investigation," she continued. "If I'd brought it to you halfway through, you would have taken it over. Brought in outside counsel immediately. Moved too fast. Given Daniel time to cover the trail. You manage things, Jason. It's what you do. You take something someone else is holding and you manage it." She paused. "I needed to finish it first. I needed it to be complete before it was yours." He didn't argue. There was nothing to argue. She was describing him with a precision that his closest friends had never managed. and she was doing it standing on wet rocks in the fading light with flour she'd probably missed on her jacket collar. "And the rest of it?" he asked. His voice was lower now. "The things that weren't about the company." She looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved between them, insistent and cold. "Same reason," she said finally. "Different stakes." He turned that over carefully. "The way you handle something that might break, if you're not paying attention." The light was almost gone now. That last thin amber line on the horizon, compressing toward dark. A wave broke loud and white against the rocks below them and retreated. And in the silence after it, something between them shifted on its axis. Not dramatically, not with the clean resolution of a scene written to satisfy, just a degree of turn, enough that the angle changed. He looked at her profile against the darkening sky, the camera hanging from her hand, the ocean doing what oceans do behind her. He thought about 5 years of cedar candles and finished sentences and a folder, with 412 files that had been, from the first document to the last annotation, an act of care so sustained and quiet that he had managed impressively to be entirely unaware of it. Something in his chest shifted, not breaking, just moving. He didn't say anything. Out here, she had taught him, silence could be its own kind of answer. The storm arrived without the courtesy of a forecast. By 7 in the evening, the wind had shifted northeast and the Atlantic was audible from inside the cottage. Not the ambient background percussion of the previous days, but something more deliberate. Waves breaking with the kind of authority that reminds you the ocean has opinions. The lights flickered twice at 7:40 held, then went out completely at 8:03, taking the Wi-Fi router and the electric stove burners with them. Audrey found the candles in the third drawer she checked, which suggested Evelyn had prepared for this before. She set 4 of them on the coffee table and 1 on the kitchen counter and lit them with the automatic efficiency of someone who had grown up in a house where the power went out in storms and nobody panicked about it. Jason stood in the middle of the living room looking at his phone screen. No signal, no connection. The little indicator cycling through its hopeless search. "Welcome to the actual end of Long Island," Audrey said, setting a candle on the windowsill. "My entire operation runs on cloud infrastructure. Your entire operation will survive one evening." She tilted her head toward the couch. "Sit down, Jason." He sat. She found a bottle of Burgundy in the cabinet above the refrigerator, a mid-range label, nothing he would have selected, which somehow made it exactly right for the occasion, and opened it without asking, poured 2 glasses, set his on the side table nearest him, and tucked herself into the opposite corner of the couch with her feet beneath her. The candles throwing warm, unsteady light across the low ceiling, the storm working itself into something serious outside. For a while they said nothing. The wine was good. The fire, which Audrey had rebuilt before the lights went out, correctly this time and without tutorial assistance, gave the room a quality of warmth that was almost architectural, the kind that changes the acoustic of a space. Outside, the wind moved through the scrub pines with a sound like water. "Tell me something that has nothing to do with the company," she said. He looked at her over the rim of his glass. "Specific category or anything. Something true." He was quiet for a moment. The candle nearest him wavered. "When I was 29, he said, I had a meeting with a venture firm in San Francisco. They were offering enough capital to restructure everything, take the company in a completely different direction, product-based rather than consultancy. I'd spent 6 weeks building the pitch." He paused. "I sat in the lobby for 40 minutes before the meeting, and then told the receptionist I'd been called back to New York, got in a cab to the airport and flew home." Audrey was watching him with the quality of attention he had come to recognize as her most serious form of listening, completely still, eyes steady, no performance of reaction. "You never told Daniel," she said. "It wasn't a question. I never told anyone." He turned the glass slowly in his hand. "I told myself it was the wrong terms, wrong timing. The truth was I was afraid that if it worked, I'd have to become someone I didn't know yet." The fire shifted. A log resettled with a soft collapse of sound. "I wrote you a letter once," Audrey said. The room changed temperature without changing temperature. 3 years ago," she continued, her voice measured and quiet, the way she spoke when something mattered enough to be handled carefully. After the Henderson account, the week you worked 4 consecutive all-nighters, and then apologized to the team for being short with them on a Friday afternoon, which nobody does, and certainly not in front of the junior staff. She looked at her wineglass, rather than at him. I wrote it that night. Explained some things. What things? She shook her head slightly. A small smile, private and complicated, moved across her mouth and disappeared. Audrey, his voice was low. Some things need the right moment, she said, or they become the wrong thing entirely. The wind hit the west wall of the cottage with a sound like a held breath released all at once. The candle between them dipped sharply and recovered. In the unsteady light, his face was all shadow and intention, and the space between them on the couch had been, over the course of the evening, conducting a slow, unannounced negotiation with itself. He leaned forward slightly, not dramatically, not with declaration, just a degree of movement that changed what the space between them meant. She did not move back. Her eyes met his with the steady, complicated clarity of someone who knows exactly what is happening and has not yet decided what to do about it. The air between them became a living thing, charged and patient and full of the particular tension of something that has waited a long time to resolve. Then her phone, restored suddenly by a single bar of returning signal, buzzed once against the side table. The moment didn't shatter. It simply paused, like a sentence interrupted before its final word, meaning suspended in the air, waiting. The call had been from Patricia Cho. Audrey had stepped outside to take it, standing on the back porch in the dark, with the storm still moving through, one arm wrapped around herself against the cold, her voice low and professional, in a way that had returned to her automatically, like muscle memory. Jason had stayed on the couch and listened to the one-sided conversation without meaning to, not the words, just the cadence. The shift from guarded to composed, the single pause that meant something significant had been said. She came back inside with wet hair and a closed expression and told him the board had convened an emergency session that afternoon, that Patricia would explain everything Monday morning, that it was nothing he needed to act on tonight. He had accepted that. They had finished the wine in a silence that was different from all the previous silences, tighter, more conscious of itself. She had gone to bed at 10:30, wished him good night from the hallway, with a neutrality so precise it had to be constructed, and closed her door. He had lain in the guest room listening to the storm finish its business with the coast, and thought about the way the space between them had felt before the phone buzzed. That particular, unrepeatable quality of a moment balanced at its own edge. He told her Sunday morning over coffee on the porch, the fog thinner than it had been all week, the ocean returning to something civil after the previous night's argument with the shore. He framed it carefully. He used words like structural realignment and board consensus and contractual, terms still being finalized, and he watched her face as he spoke with the attention of a man who had recently learned the cost of not watching. She listened without interrupting, both hands around her mug, her eyes on the middle distance where the fog was burning off above the waterline. The board wanted her back, not in her previous role. 3 floors above it, director of operations, company-wide scope, a seat at the table she had spent 5 years supplying with information, while standing outside the room. He finished. The porch was quiet except for the gulls working the beach below. Say the actual thing, Audrey said. He looked at her. I just did. You said what the board wants. She turned to face him, and her eyes were direct and unhurried and completely without mercy in the way. That honest things are never merciful. What do you want? The question sat between them in the cold morning air. He had prepared for negotiation, for conditions, for the measured professional deliberation she brought to every significant decision. He had not prepared for this, the simple, load-bearing directness of it, the way it made every carefully constructed sentence he'd assembled feel suddenly like architecture built around an empty center. I want you to come back, he said, to the company. A pause that lasted exactly long enough to mean something. Yes. She studied him for a moment with the expression he'd seen on the rocks at the lighthouse, that clear-eyed, patient assessment that saw around the edges of things. Then she turned back to the ocean. Tell Patricia yes, she said. On the terms I'll send her Monday. "And the other question," he said quietly. "The one you told me I was actually asking." Audrey was quiet for a long moment. A pelican crossed the sky above the waterline, low and deliberate, and she watched it until it disappeared into the fog at the south end of the beach. When she spoke, her voice was careful in the way of someone handling something they don't want to drop. "Not yet," she said. 2 words. The same number he had sent her on a Sunday 9 days ago. Not necessary, but arranged into something that functioned entirely differently. Not a dismissal. A door left open at a specific angle, enough to show the light inside without granting entry. He nodded, set his coffee mug on the porch railing, and looked at his hands, those hands that his mother had once said never knew what to do with themselves when he wasn't working. She had been right. He had spent 38 years filling them with tasks and decisions and the clean, manageable weight of things that could be resolved. Standing on that porch in the thin November fog, with the ocean doing its indifferent work on the shore below, and Audrey sitting 3 feet away reading the horizon with the patience of someone who understood. Long views. His hands felt empty in a way that had nothing to do with having nothing to hold. He drove back to Manhattan that afternoon. The letter he'd brought was still on the small table beside the front door where he'd set it Friday evening. She hadn't touched it, he hadn't mentioned it. It remained there as he backed out of the gravel drive, a white rectangle in the warm light of the cottage interior, visible through the window as he pulled away, waiting, like everything else, for the right moment that hadn't arrived yet. The Mercer Group's 39th floor had been renovated during Audrey's 3 weeks away. New glass partitions, a reconfigured open plan, the kind of deliberate spatial reset that companies perform after seismic events to signal that the architecture of what happened before no longer applies. Audrey noticed all of it on her first morning back. The new partition angles, the different placement of the printer stations, the way the light fell differently across the east side of the floor now that the wall dividing legal from operations had been removed, she noticed, and she filed it. And she walked to her new office on the 39th floor without stopping. I tell you, the desk she'd occupied for 5 years on the 36th. The office had a window, a real one, floor-to-ceiling, south-facing, with a view of lower Manhattan that on clear mornings included a thin silver suggestion of the harbor. There was a glass desk, a low credenza, 2 chairs for visitors, and a peace lily someone had placed on the windowsill that she suspected was Trevor's doing, though she couldn't have said why. She set her bag down, opened her laptop, and spent the first 40 minutes reading the operational reports that had accumulated in her absence, with the focused appetite of someone returning to a language they think in. The work was familiar, and the scale was larger, and both of these things were exactly right. Jason Mercer occupied the 42nd floor, which meant that in the normal course of a working day, their paths did not cross organically. What they had instead were scheduled touch points, a Monday operational briefing, a Wednesday cross-functional review, the occasional email thread that required a direct response rather than a delegated one. Every interaction was conducted with a professionalism so precisely calibrated it had its own specific weight. They were courteous, they were efficient, they were excellent at their respective roles and careful not to stand too close, in rooms where other people were present. The restraint was in its own way exhausting. On the second Tuesday, a coffee appeared on her desk at 8:15. Her order, oat milk, flat white, 1 sugar, the temperature specification that most baristas ignored, and this one hadn't. No note. No indication of origin beyond the fact that it hadn't been there when she'd stepped away to the printer 3 minutes earlier. She looked at it for a moment. Then she picked up the cup, walked to the elevator, rode it to the 42nd floor, and set it on Jason's assistant's desk without explanation. Trevor relayed this information to Jason with the careful neutrality of someone, learning quickly which details required discretion. The following Tuesday, another coffee appeared. Same order, same temperature. This time with a yellow post-it attached to the sleeve. I remembered. That counts for something. 6 words in his handwriting, the same deliberate, slightly angular script as the letter she hadn't opened, the letter currently residing in the top drawer of her credenza beneath the operational calendar and a box of paper clips. She had moved it there from her bag on the first day without examining why she hadn't left it at the cottage. She read the post-it twice, folded it in half along its existing crease, placed it in the left pocket of her charcoal blazer. She did not send the coffee back. She also did not acknowledge it, which was its own form of communication, and one she suspected he understood. The post-it stayed in her pocket for 7 days. She transferred it from the charcoal blazer to the navy one on Thursday, then to her coat on the weekend, then back to the blazer on Monday. It was a small, slightly ridiculous thing to keep. She was aware of this, but there was something in the 6 words that resisted being put down. Not the sentiment exactly, but the precision of it. I remembered. That counts for something. Not an apology, not a promise, not any of the large currency emotional denominations that people deploy when they want credit for feeling something. Just a small, specific, accurate thing. She knew accurate things were harder to produce than grand ones. She had always known this about him, that when Jason Mercer got something right, it was never by accident. On the Thursday of the 2nd week, they rode the elevator together for 14 floors, she going up, he going down, the doors opening on 39 to find him already inside. They said good morning. They discussed a vendor contract that required her sign-off. The elevator smelled like his cedar, not the candle, just him. The same bass note she'd spent 5 years cataloguing without meaning to. When the doors opened on 25 and he stepped out, he paused with one hand on the doorframe and looked back at her with the expression she'd seen on the Montauk porch. Open, unguarded, slightly undone. "The coffee was right?" he asked. She met his eyes. "It was right." He nodded once, let the doors close. She rode the rest of the way to 39 with her hand in her pocket, the post-it folded between her fingers, the city sliding past the elevator's glass exterior, 40 stories above. Everything that was still unfinished between them. The night the verdict came through, Manhattan did what Manhattan always does with significant human events. It continued, indifferent and luminous. 40 stories below the Mercer Group rooftop terrace, its grid of light extending in every direction with the particular arrogance of a city that has outlasted every private crisis ever conducted above it. Audrey had been in the building until 9:30. Not because she needed to be. The legal team had handled the final proceedings, and Patricia Cho had sent a group message at 7:46, confirming what everyone had spent months working toward: Daniel Holt, convicted on 6 counts of wire fraud and financial misconduct. Sentencing in February. The company's restructured accounts fully restored. The quiet, meticulous documentation of a woman who had stayed awake for 91 nights, doing what no one had asked her to do, entered into the court record and acknowledged in the judgment as instrumental. She had read the message at her desk, set her phone face down, and looked out the south-facing window at the harbor for a long time, without moving. Then she had taken the elevator to the roof. The terrace was technically accessible to senior staff, but functionally unused. In November, too exposed, too cold, the kind of place that existed in company literature, but not in actual behavior. Audrey had discovered it in her 3rd year, during a product launch week that had required 18-hour days and the occasional need for sky. She had never told anyone about it. It was, in the private geography of the building, entirely hers. She stood at the north railing with her coat pulled close, the wind doing its considered work on the city below, and breathed the cold air that tasted of exhaust and steel and the faint ghost of the river 3 miles west. The city from 40 stories looked like a circuit board dreaming of itself, all signal and light, and the suggestion of enormous invisible intention. She heard the rooftop door open behind her at 10:04. She didn't turn around. Footsteps measured, familiar, the particular rhythm she had catalogued over 5 years without ever intending. So he stopped a few feet behind her. She could feel the specific quality of his presence the way you feel a change in air pressure, not dramatic, just unmistakably there. "Trevor told me you were still in the building," Jason said. "Trevor needs to work on discretion. I've been telling him that for weeks." Pause. The wind moved between them. "Audrey." "I know," she said quietly. "I heard." He came to stand beside her at the railing, close enough that their arms nearly touched, both of them looking out at the city rather than at each other. Below, a siren moved up 6th Avenue and faded. Someone's Friday night, someone's emergency. The city processing it all with equal momentum. "There's something I need to give you," he said. She turned then. He was holding an envelope. Not the corporate kind, not white and rectangular and smelling of institutional. Consequence the way the last envelope he'd handed her had. This one was cream-colored and slightly worn at the corners, sealed with the kind of adhesive that had long since done its job. Addressed in handwriting she recognized as her own from 3 years ago. In the upper left corner, where a return address would go, she had written nothing, just a date, November 3 years prior. Her breath left her body in a slow, controlled way that had nothing to do with the cold. "Your mother," she said. Not a question. She found it in the writing desk you left behind. "The one you said belonged to your grandmother." His voice was careful, the way it got when he was saying something he had rehearsed and then abandoned. The rehearsal of, "She called me 2 weeks ago. Said she thought I should be the one to bring it." A pause. "She was fairly direct about the reasons. She usually is." He extended the envelope. I didn't open it. Audrey looked at it in his hand, that cream rectangle that contained, as best she could remember, the clearest and most complete thing she had ever written, and then decided the world wasn't ready for. 3 years ago she had sealed it, addressed it, and then placed it in the drawer rather than the mail slot, which was its own kind of answer to a question she hadn't been ready to ask. "I want you to read it to me," Jason said. "If you're willing." The city pulsed below them. 40 stories of glass and steel and human noise rising and falling with the steady rhythm of something that would long outlast every fear either of them had ever organized their behavior around. Audrey looked at him in the dark, this man who had taken 11 years to take an unplanned afternoon, who had driven 4 hours with a handwritten letter and stood outside a cottage, talis for 90 seconds before knocking, who had sent coffee with 6 words on a post-it and called it enough, because sometimes enough is exactly the right size for a beginning. She took the envelope from his hand, broke the seal with a clean, unhesitating motion, unfolded the pages, 3 of them, her handwriting smaller and more urgent than she remembered. She read. The wind held its breath. The city continued below as it always had, as it always would. But up here, above all of it, 2 people stood in the cold November dark and let the silence after the last word become the only answer that had ever mattered. No contracts, no conditions. No carefully negotiated terms, just this, the particular, irreversible quiet of 2 people who had finally stopped translating and chosen, at last, to speak. She had fired her with 2 words and an envelope. She had saved him with 91 nights of silence, and somewhere between a cottage in Montauk and a rooftop above Manhattan, 2 people who had spent years speaking the same language without ever truly listening finally found the courage to stop translating. Jason Mercer learned, too late and just in time, that the most valuable thing in his building had never been on any balance sheet. Some people walk out of our lives carrying everything we never said. The real question isn't whether we recognize them before they go. It's whether we become someone worth returning to. If this story moved something in you, subscribe, leave a like, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're listening from tonight. Every story finds its people. Thank you for letting this one find you.